from a searing chaos of light. Chaotic tumult. From the slackened grip of Ventnor and Drake, the body of Ruth dropped while we three stood blinded, deafened, fighting for recovery. Ruth twisted, rolled toward the brink. Ventnor threw himself upon her, held her fast. Dragging her, crawling on our knees, we crept forward. We stopped when the thinning of the mists permitted us to see through them, yet still interposed a curtaining which, though tenuous, dimmed the intolerable brilliancy that filled the pit, muffled its din to a degree we could bear. I peered through them, and nerve and muscle were locked in the grip of a paralyzing awe. I felt then as one would feel set close to warring regiments of stars, made witness to the death throes of a universe, or swept through space and held above the whirling coils of Andromeda's nebula to watch its birth agonies of nascent suns. These are no figures of speech, no hyperboles. Speck as our whole planet would be in Andromeda's vast loom, pinprick as was the pit to the cyclone craters of our own sun, within the cliff-cupped walls of the valley was a tangible, struggling, living force akin to that which dwells within the nebula and the star, a cosmic spirit transcending all dimensions and thrusting its confines out into the infinite, a sentient emanation of the infinite itself. Nor was its voice less unearthly. It used the shell of the earth valley for its trumpetings, its clangors, but as one hears in the murmurings of the fluted conch the great voice of the ocean, its whispering and its roarings, so here in the clamorous shell of the pit echoed the tremendous voices of that illimitable sea which laps the shores of the countless suns. I looked upon a mighty whirlpool miles and miles wide. It whirled with surges whose racing crests were smiting incandescences. It was threaded with a spindrift of lightnings. It was trodden by dervish mists of molten flame, thrust through with forests of lances of living light. It cast a cadent spray high into the heavens. Over it the heavens glittered as though they were a shield held by fearful gods. Through the maelstrom staggered a mountainous bulk, a gleaming leviathan of pale blue metal caught in the swirling tide of some incredible volcano, a huge arc of metal breasting a deluge of flame. And the drumming we heard, as of hollow beaten metal worlds, the shouting tempests of cannonading stars, was the breaking of these incandescent crests, the falling of the lightning spindrift, the rhythmic impact of the lanced rays upon the glimmering mountain that reeled and trembled as they struck it. The reeling mountain, the struggling leviathan, was the City. It was the mass of the metal monster itself, guarded by, stormed by its own legions that though separate from it were still as much of it as were the cells that formed the skin of its walls, its carapace. It was the metal monster tearing, rending, fighting for, battling against itself. Mile high as when I had first beheld it was the inexplicable body that held the great heart of the cones into which had been drawn the magnetic cataracts from our sun, that held too the smaller hearts of the lesser cones, the workshops, the birth chamber, and manifold other mysteries unguessed and unseen. By a full fourth had its base been shrunken. Ranged in double line along the side turned toward us were hundreds of dread forms, shapes that in their intensity bore down upon, oppressed with a nightmare weight, the consciousness. Rectangular upon their outlines, no spike of pyramid, no curve of globe showing, uncompromisingly ponderous, they upthrust. Upon the tops of the first rank were enormous masses, sledge-shaped, like those metal fists that had battered down the walls of Cherkis's city, but to them as the human hand is to the paw of the dinosaur. Conceive this, conceive these shapes as animate and flexible, beating down with the prodigious mallets, smashing from side to side as though the tremendous pillars that held them were thousand-jointed upright pistons. That, as closely as I can present it in images of things we know, is the picture of the hammering things. Behind them stood a second row, high as they and angular. From them extended scores of girdered arms. These were thickly studded with the flaming cruciform shapes, the opened cubes gleaming with their angry flares of reds and smoky yellows. From the tentacles of many swung immense shields like those which ringed the hall of the great cones, and as the sledges beat, ever over their bent heads poured from the crosses a flood of crimson lightnings. Out of the concave depths of the shields whipped lashes of blinding flame. With ropes of fire they knouted the things the sledges struck. The sullen crimson levins blasted. Now I could see the shapes that attacked. Grotesque, spined and tusked, spiked and antlered, wenned and breasted, as chimerically angled, cusped and cornute as though they were the superangled, supercornute gods of the cusped and angled gods of the Javanese. They strove against the sledge-headed and smiting, the multi-armed and blasting square towers. High as them and huge as they, incomparably fantastic, in dozens of shifting forms they battled. More than a mile from the stumbling city stood ranged like sharpshooters a host of solid, bristling-legged towers. Upon their tops spun gigantic wheels. Out of the centers of these wheels shot the radiant lances, hosts of spears of intensest violet light. The radiance they volleyed was not continuous. It was broken, so that the javelin rays shot out in rhythmic flights, each flying fast upon the shafts of the others. It was their impact that sent forth the thunderous drumming. They struck and splintered against the walls, dropping from them in great gouts of molten flame. It was as though before they broke they pierced the wall. The monster's side bled fire. With the crashing of broadsides of massed batteries, the sledges smashed down upon the bristling attackers. Under the awful impact, globes and pyramids were shattered into hundreds of fragments. Rocket bursts of blue and azure and violet flame, flames rainbowed and irised. The hammer ends split, flew apart, were scattered, were falling showers of sulphurous yellow and scarlet meteors. But ever other cubes swarmed out and repaired the broken smiting tips, and always where a tusked and cornute shape had been battered down, disintegrated, another arose as huge and as formidable, pouring forth upon the squared tower its lightnings, tearing at it with colossal spiked and hooked claws, beating it with incredible spiked and globular fists that were like the clenched hands of some metal Atlas. As the striving shapes swayed and wrestled, gave way or thrust forward, staggered or fell, the bulk of the monster stumbled and swayed, advanced and retreated, an unearthly motion wedded to an amorphous immensity that flooded the watching consciousness with a deathly nausea. Unceasingly the hail of radiant lances poured from the spinning wheels, falling upon towered shapes and city's wall alike. There arose a prodigious wailing, an unearthly thin screaming. About the bases of the defenders flashed blinding bursts of incandescence, like those which had heralded the flight of the flying thing dropping before Norhala's house. Unlike them, they held no dazzling sapphire brilliancies. They were ochreous, suffused with raging vermilion. Nevertheless, they were factors of that same inexplicable action, for from thousands of gushing lights leaped thousands of gigantic square pillars, unimaginable projectiles, hurled from the flaming mouths of earth-hidden titanic mortars. They soared high, swerved and swooped upon the lance throwers. Beneath their onslaught those chimerae tottered. I saw living projectiles and living target fuse where they met, melt and weld in jets of lightnings. But not all. There were those that tore great gaps in the horned giants, wounds that instantly were healed, with globes and pyramids seething out from the cyclopean trunk. Ever the incredible projectiles flashed and flew as though from some inexhaustible store. Ever uprose that prodigious barrage against the smiting rays. Now to check them soared from the ranks of the besiegers clouds of countless horned dragons, immense cylinders of clustered cubes studded with the clinging tetrahedrons. They struck the cubed projectiles head on, aimed themselves to meet them. Bristling dragon and hurtling pillar stuck and fused or burst with intolerable blazing. They fell, cube and sphere and pyramid, some half opened, some fully, in a rain of disks of stars, huge flaming crosses, a storm of unimaginable pyrotechnics. Now I became conscious that within the city, within the body of the metal monster, there raged a strife colossal as this without. From it came a vast volcanic roaring. Up from its top shot tortured flames, cascades and fountains of frenzied things that looped and struggled, writhed over its edge, hurled themselves back, battling chimerae which, against the glittering heavens, traced luminous symbols of agony. Shrilled a stronger wailing. Up from beneath the ray-hurling towers shot hosts of globes. Thousands of palely azure metal moons they soared, warrior moons, charging in meteor rush and streaming with fluttering battle pennons of violet flame. High they flew. They curved over the mile-high back of the monster. They dropped upon it. Arose to meet them the immense columns of the cubes, battered against the spheres, swept them over and down into the depths. Hundreds fell, broken, but thousands held their place. I saw them twine about the pillars, writhing columns of interlaced cubes and globes, straining like monstrous serpents, while all along their coils the open discs and crosses smote with the scimitars of their lightnings. In the wall of the city appeared a shining crack. From top to bottom it ran. It widened into a rift from which a flood of radiance gushed.